I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. Langston Hughes. Welcome to Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. So, this week, we have a kind of finale to our discussion about the Horn of Africa and the peoples kind of living in that area. But before we get to that, I do want to thank everyone for listening and who has been listening and continues to listen, as well as any newcomers that may be joining us with this episode. Now, this is the second episode I've recorded today. I've already recorded a bonus episode, my long promised review of the movie Alpha, and I know it's been probably 2 weeks since I had tried to have that up initially. I wanted it out on Memorial Day, but unfortunately, due to travel issues with my car and a number of things coming up at my day job, I just have not had time to do normal life stuff and sit down and record it. However, due to me not doing anything this weekend, I actually have time to set aside and do some in-depth recording for that episode, and then I'm now recording this one. And that bonus episode ended up being a lot longer than I had planned, almost 45 minutes long. So I have gone ahead and have that scheduled to upload this afternoon, which is Sunday, June the 12th. Should come up sometime around 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here in the U.S. And this one will come out at its regular time on Monday mornings. But that said, again, thank you all for listening. Please enjoy. And now we're going to get into the meat of this episode. So, again, we're shifting away from the Horn of Africa, and we're going to be moving into what is Northern Africa. And to do that, we need to focus on the ancestors of the Nilotic peoples. And then we will cover ancestors of the other Nilo-Saharan language speakers. Although, as you might guess from the name, Nilotic peoples, they are from the Nile River. And they're considered to be the indigenous people of that area. And today, these peoples are found in South Sudan, along the White Nile, as well as around Lake Victoria and the western banks of Lake Turkana. And they can be found all the way south of the Great Rift Valley. Of course, at around 10,000 BC, we're not sure of their exact numbers or distribution, but at the very least, they're somewhere in the White Nile Valley, where after it leaves Lake Victoria, of course. And this may be a little bit of a difficult kind of area to focus on, because at this point in time, they may not be all that separate in terms of peoples. There may only be a few handfuls of groups, a couple hundred strong apiece. And again, they may not even be around Lake Turkana at this point. We may be well outside of the Horn of Africa entirely. But that said, I think just due to where they're located, it's going to be a little hard to focus on them at any other time, at least until they, of course, have more identifiable modern groups, or at least ancestors of modern groups. But that's it. I do think they deserve, study and recognition. So, these people are, of course, like all humans at this point in time, hunter-gatherers. They are located somewhere along the Nile Valley. Now, obviously, that covers a very wide range for them to be living in. We, of course, do not know where exactly in the Nile Valley they originated, but that kind of distribution leads into another problem when discussing these people. I know that I've mentioned that they're called Nilotic. That is a group of several peoples. They are not speaking Nilotic at this point. They are probably speaking a proto-version of Eastern Sudanic, which is itself part of the Nilo-Saharan language family. And this brings us into another problem when discussing this area and these peoples. Nilo-Saharan is a kind of a large language family that was proposed by Joseph Greenberg in his Languages of Africa, or Language Families of Africa. The Languages of Africa is his paper. It's kind of the milestone, the touchstone of African language studies for a long time. And there's a lot of very good stuff in that, and a lot of people respect that work. It's the one that kind of laid out the Afro-Asiatic distinction, the Niger-Congo distinction, Khoisan, and of course Austronesian for Madagascar, which is way in the future. We'll get to that much later. But Nilo-Saharan is the least, I guess you could call it, verified or kind of fleshed out of those families. A lot of people said that basically Greenberg just dumped everything that didn't neatly fit into one of those others, kind of into this kind of large, widespread group. He also argued that this was a genetic family, so that in addition to being related linguistically, all these people were related ethnically as well. Now, since that time, people have kind of dug into these languages. They've tested those theories, kind of pruned and trimmed the trees, rearranged certain families into a different branch, or just put them out altogether or brought them back in. There's been a lot of work on this, and there are still a lot of in-depth studies. People keep going back and forth on this. Some of the bigger names are Blinch. I believe Starostin is another. And then you have Dimmadal. So you've got a lot of groups and researchers going back and forth on this, and they're kind of in and out of who belongs where. It's a very complicated study, and I do not understand a lot of the linguistic parts of it, other than just kind of them specifically mentioning groups and talking about stuff that they have in common, both ethnically and historically speaking. The reason I'm mentioning all this is just to say I'm going to get some of this wrong. And I'm going to get some of this wrong probably several times, just as the people who are still studying this have gotten stuff wrong. And I know that eventually they're going to come out with a much more concise and updated version, and that's part of academics. That's part of studying this stuff. So you test theories, you kind of bounce them off each other, you just dive into it. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to dive into a general kind of outline of what is probably going on at this point in time. And again, this is probably going to be proven wrong. They're probably going to come out with a study in a couple of years saying, oh yeah, no, all these people are genetically related. These people are not these people. So yeah, no, it's going to completely throw everything I say into kind of flux, and probably, again, just being flat out wrong. But I do kind of want to give a reasonable narrative based on what I have learned, as of now. So just bear in mind that this is going to be just a little bit of me guessing for a lot of this stuff. So Nilotic peoples, again, these are all over those areas along the White Nile, the Lake Victoria, all the way south through the Great Rift and along Lake Turkana. These people are, in modern day, typically speaking, the opposite of pygmies, at least in terms when it comes to physiology. They, as a group, are taller on average than any other ethnic group in the world. I think the average height for their men is like 6'5", and their women, I think it's like 6 feet even. So they're a very tall group as a whole. Obviously, there are differences. Some people will be quite tall, some quite low. Dikembe Mutombo, NBA Hall of Famer, he is, of course, from one of these ethnic groups. He's quite tall as well. And, of course, they do have uh, typically much darker skin than even the rest of Africa. Some people have referred to them as burnt skin in historical records. Obviously, that is not, something I would use to describe them, but that is how some people have described them historically speaking, especially in the Roman period when we get to kind of Greek and Roman period when we get to those writers and those explorers and people talking about that kind of group. The Maasai are descendants of this group. They're, of course, the most famous, probably East African group. They wear those very bright, colorful red and blue robes and tunics. They are some of the greatest hunters in the area, even into this day. And their language is eventually going to be kind of the trade language for this region. It's going to be used by a lot of groups. But again, that's all in the future. So, and this group's kind of going to stay together for a little while. I don't think they kind of start spreading apart and developing individual identities and languages for another several thousand years. I think around, around 3000 BC or so. But they are kind of in a very unique position in Africa. We've talked about how the Khoisan were so isolated from everyone else, how the people in the Congo, Central Africans, are isolated from everyone else, how the West Africans are, for the most part, isolated, at least at this point in time. I don't think this is going to be as true of the people living along the valley, the Nile Valley. The Nilotic peoples, they are kind of going to be a mixing pot comparatively to other African cultures, at least for the first few thousand years of kind of more recorded history. They are going to share borders, or more navigable borders with their neighbors, or I guess different groups. They are going to be able to interact with the Cushitic speakers to their east. They are going to be able to interact with the kind of the outskirts of first the Central Africans and then the West Africans who begin to migrate out of there into Central Africa, and even still parts of the Khoi peoples. And eventually the peoples to their north are going to interact with as well, the Proto-Egyptians, who we will get to. And even their cousins, at least linguistically speaking, if the Nilo-Saharan family holds true, they're going to be interacting with their cousins in the Sahara. So they are going to have a lot of, they're going to be very important to this region for a number of reasons, both for travel, trade, as guides, and even as a kind of a means of transporting or communicating various knowledges between these two groups. So it allows them to kind of remain separate. It allows them to develop their own identities without being subsumed by these big cultures. Their knowledge of the area is going to be extremely important. And while they are kind of hemmed in by these other groups, they are kind of a good balance between the groups. They are kind of able to, I guess, not necessarily play these outsiders off of each other, but they make themselves very important as middlemen. And that sounds a little derogatory. If to some it might seem that way, but no, I mean that with the most respect. And it's such a valuable place that they have in history in Africa, in the history of Africa, in the history of the world. They are going to be extremely important. They are kind of they're the catalyst for the melting pot that is Eastern Africa. So yeah, I don't want to think that I'm downplaying their role or that I consider them kind of, you know, less important. No, these people, their importance cannot be overstated. And we'll get to that. These people are going to be probably the first pastoralists of Africa. They're the ones that are going to kind of introduce pastoralism to a lot of their neighbors. And they were going to be the most successful pastoralists. In fact, some of the first conflicts we'll get to in this continent are going to be between the emerging pastoralists and the emerging agriculturalists of West Africa. Although I guess it would be more the people who picked up pastoralism from the Nilotic peoples are going to run into the agriculturalists expanding eastward from West Africa. But again, that's in the future. So we'll cover that in more detail much later. Now, these people, their ethnic faiths have held on much better than the Omotic peoples, or the people in kind of the Horn of Africa area, where they have been very much Christianized and Islamized in terms of religious studies. The Dinka religion is kind of a modern branch that has kind of come through all that. Christianity is kind of in the more southern part of Sudan these days, and these peoples, they have had, I think, a little bit more inroads with Christianity more recently, but there were some Arabic influences as well. But there are those that still practice traditional faiths. The Dinka religion, for one, is probably the best known, at least outside of Africa. Again, we kind of run into some of the more traditional, I guess, Southern African beliefs. There's a little bit of overlap. There is a supreme creator God. He's the god of the sky and the rain, and kind of the ruler of all the spirits. And he is kind of he's much more hands-on, at least from what has come through to modern stories. The supreme god of the Dinka religion is Nileic. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. If not, I'm butchering it. It's kind of how it works. He is very much in control of the destiny of the world and the animal. Like, basically everything. He can kind of put them on whatever path he wants. Basically, he's much more hands-on than, say, the Khoi or the San deities. He is also known by other names depending on the group. Diokin is another group. Yuang. I think another name is Ja'ak is another name that kind of that is used for him depending on the group. He is not a demiurge. He creates existence from nothingness. He is not someone that is found material from another source and then uses that to fashion the world anew, the way the San deity, he created the world while everyone was living underground in the first world. This is basically everything is coming from him. Now, whether or not that's the case at the beginning of this kind of faith, or if this is something that kind of got incorporated once they began interacting with, say, Islam or Christianity, I don't know. That's something I'm going to have to dig into. Thankfully, there are a lot of sources on the Dinka religion, and I'll get into that again when we kind of get into more substantial studies on these people, when we can actually identify kind of the groups that this religion kind of originates with. But that said, so yes, there is a traditional African faith among these people. It is something that has been continuously practiced for quite a while, and it is something traditional, or at least has very old traditional elements in it. It's not just something that is aping Christianity or Islam, though there may be some incorporation from those outside groups, maybe to compete against them. Again, when we get back to this area in the future, when there are more concrete sources to go on, I'll dive further into this religion, because thankfully there are a lot of sources on it. Yes, the Nilotic peoples, they are very important for the transmission of knowledge between different groups. They are going to be basically the only peoples that really navigate the Nile Valley and its kind of get to its source for quite a while, or at least allow travel through those sources. Of course, the Europeans, this was a very big deal, they finding the source of the Nile, but the Nilotic peoples, they have been in and around this area for basically all of existence, or give or take. And they're the people that are going to kind of guide the Europeans through here when we get to the Age of Discovery and the Victorian era. But they were probably helping Arab traders through the area, as well as other groups. So, I think that's a good place to stop for now. The Nilotic people, again, they have a very large range today. They may have been not even Nilotic at this point. They may still be an Eastern Sudanic language group. They may have been like an even larger group than there is now. That is up for debate. When we return for next week, though, we are going to kind of continue to move to the north, kind of to the northwest from here. Not along the Nile, but more out into what is now a desert, but at the time was probably a little bit more grassland focused, and probably get around to the area of Lake Chad a little before we kind of continue on and out of Africa. So, when we do that, that will be next Sunday. That's the 19th. And then we'll have one more full episode on June the 26th. Now, after that, we'll have July the 4th is that weekend, or that Monday. So there will not be an episode on July the 3rd. I will return that following Sunday at the 10th. So, look forward to doing those next two episodes. And I'm going to try and have us out of, or covered most of the pertinent information in Africa at 10,000 BC, basically at the end of June, and then we'll be moving into Southwest Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, that kind of area, and then we'll continue on from there. I'm looking forward to it. We're eventually going to get to the kind of the beginnings of pastoralism and then agriculture in those areas, and the more, I guess, permanent settlements, you'd call it. I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode and is going to continue to listen. Thank you all so much for your support, and those that do provide regular feedback, I really appreciate it. And if you'd like to provide feedback, please feel free. You can contact me at my email, which is waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also reach me via direct message on Twitter. I will respond there, and I will post the link in the episode description if you would like to follow there. Again, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.